The cold is a physical presence, seeping through your uniform and chilling the steel of your M8 Greyhound. Your world is this narrow, snow-dusted road near Stavelot. You are Staff Sergeant Robert Harper, and your reconnaissance squadron is all that stands between an entire German spearhead and its objective. The 37mm gun at your command is dismissed by intelligence as a relic. But as the hulking shapes of German half-tracks emerge from the winter mist, you see not their strength, but their arrogance. They don't see you. And in this moment, that is the only weapon you need. This was the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, a landscape transformed into a monochromatic nightmare of white and gray. For the American GIs caught in the sudden, violent storm of the German counteroffensive, the cold was another enemy. It froze weapons, numbed fingers, and stole the will to fight. In this chaos, the reconnaissance units, the eyes and ears of the army, were thrust into a desperate new role. They were no longer just scouts, they were speed bumps, thrown in the path of an armored avalanche to buy time, measured in minutes and paid for in blood. The vehicle for this desperate task was the M8 light armored car, affectionately and appropriately nicknamed the Greyhound. It was a machine born for a different kind of war, with 6 massive wheels and a top speed that could push 60 miles per hour on a good road. It was designed to probe, to observe, and to run. Its armor was just thick enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel, a thin skin of steel that offered more psychological comfort than actual protection against anything serious. Its crew of 4 men knew they were not in a tank. Their greatest assets were their speed and their radio. Get in, get the information, and get out before the enemy knew you were there. That was the doctrine, drilled into them back at training grounds like Fort Riley, Kansas. But doctrine was a world away from the frozen Belgian forest. The heart of the Greyhound and the source of its crew's greatest anxiety was its main armament, the 37mm M6 gun. By the standards of late 1944, it was a pea shooter. It was a weapon designed in a previous era, when tanks were thinner-skinned and less monstrous. Against the sloped frontal armor of a German Panther or the thick hide of a Tiger, a 37mm shell was little more than a steel-tipped firecracker. American tankers had learned this the hard way in North Africa and Normandy. Consequently, the weapon and the vehicles that carried it were viewed with a degree of skepticism, even disdain, by the men who had to fight in them. The Germans, with their meticulous intelligence gathering, knew all of this. Their analysis was, on the surface, entirely correct. They classified the M8 as a Spähpanzer, a scout car. They noted its high speed, its light armor, and its seemingly inadequate main gun. To the planners of the offensive and the commanders on the ground, like the formidable Obersturmbannführer German Peiper, the Greyhound was a non-threat. It was a reconnaissance element to be brushed aside by the true instruments of war, the Panzerfoes, the Panthers, and the mechanized infantry in their Sd.Kfz, 251 half-tracks. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the sharpest point of the entire German spearhead, was a combined arms battle group designed for rapid, brutal exploitation. It was not expected to be slowed, let alone stopped, by a handful of American scout cars. This confidence, born from accurate but incomplete intelligence, bred a fatal assumption. The Germans calculated the M8 gun's performance against their tanks and have found it wanting. They failed to ask a different, more relevant question. What could that gun do to the vehicles that made up the bulk of their columns? the steel skin of their workhorse Sd.Kfz. 251 was, at its thickest, only about 14.5 millimeters. It was designed to protect its cargo of Panzer Grenadiers from rifle bullets and shell splinters, not from direct-fire anti-tank rounds. And so, on the morning of December 18th, two worlds collided on that road near Stavelot. On one side, a German column advancing with doctrinal confidence, their half-tracks filled with veteran infantry, pressing forward with the urgency of a grand strategy. On the other, a few shivering American crewmen in a vehicle they knew was a compromise, a machine built for speed, not a stand-up fight. They were the remnant of the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a thin, fragile line. But they held the one advantage that German intelligence had overlooked, the perfect weapon for the perfect target. The engine of Staff Sergeant Harper's Greyhound was a low thrum against the oppressive silence of the snow-covered woods. Every creak of the suspension, every crackle over the radio was magnified in the tension-filled air. His troop of the 87th Cavalry was not supposed to be here, fighting a pitched battle. Their job was the cavalry's timeless mission, to find the enemy, to report their strength and disposition, and to screen the main body of the army. In the chaos that followed the German breakthrough, however, their mission had devolved into a series of desperate holding actions. Every bridge, every crossroads, every defensible piece of terrain became a vital strong point to be held for as long as possible. The 7th Armored Division, their parent unit, was fighting for its life, and the cavalry squadrons were its first line of defense, a tripwire meant to blunt the enemy's charge. The men inside the M8 were a tight-knit team, honed by months of combat since landing in Normandy. The driver kept the engine running, ready to throw the vehicle into reverse and escape the moment an order was given. The gunner's eye was pressed to the sight of the 37-millimeter gun, his hand resting on the traverse wheel, scanning the gray wall of fog that concealed the road ahead. The commander, Harper, split his attention between peering through his binoculars and listening to the radio, trying to build a mental map of a battlefield that was dissolving into confusion. The myth of the ghost front had been shattered. The enemy was real, and he was coming in force. Down the road, hidden from Harper's view, the vanguard of Kampfgruppe Peiper was advancing with a disciplined momentum. Johann Peiper was a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, a commander who understood the value of speed. His orders were to push relentlessly toward the Meuse River, bypassing resistance wherever possible and smashing through it where necessary. His column was a mix of panzers and the ubiquitous Sd.Kfz, 251 half-tracks, a symbol of German mechanized warfare. These vehicles were the lifeblood of the Blitzkrieg. They could carry a squad of 10 Panzer Grenadiers, keeping pace with the tanks across country, allowing infantry to support armor and armor to support infantry in a seamless, devastating partnership. The half-track was a marvel of engineering, but it was a vehicle of compromises. Its front-mounted engine was protected, and the driver sat behind an armored glacis, but the main passenger compartment was open-topped, and its sides were slab-sided plates of steel, barely more than half an inch thick. This design was a trade-off. It sacrificed protection for mobility and manufacturing efficiency, allowing Germany to field vast numbers of them. It was a perfectly adequate design for its intended role, operating under the protective umbrella of heavy tanks, shielded from enemy anti-tank guns. But as the lead vehicles of Peiper's column approached Stavelot, they were not operating under that umbrella. The tanks had been delayed or diverted, and the infantry-laden half-tracks were pushing ahead, confident that they would only encounter scattered resistance from demoralized American infantry. It was a classic case of reconnaissance pulling ahead of the main force, a calculated risk that Peiper was willing to take to maintain his timetable. Back in the American position, the sound came first. It was a low, guttural growl of powerful engines, a sound that was distinctly not American. It grew from a subtle vibration in the frozen ground to a clear, mechanical chorus. Harper gave a quiet order. The gunner traversed the small turret, the gears whining softly in the cold. The loader had already breached the gun and slammed around into the chamber. An M51 armor-piercing capped, or APC, shell. It was a solid shot, a 37-millimeter dart of hardened steel designed to do one thing, punched through armor plate. Then they emerged from the mist. The first shape was angular and menacing, its half-track configuration unmistakable. Then another and another. A whole column, moving steadily, methodically, completely unaware of the Greyhound, tucked into a fold in the terrain just off the road. The German crews were exposed in their open-topped compartments, their posture relaxed, their attention focused forward. To them, the woods were just woods. The silence was just silence. They were hunting, and they did not know they were also the prey. For the crew of the M8 Greyhound, time seemed to slow down. The advancing German half-tracks grew larger in the gunner's sight, resolving from gray silhouettes into detailed targets. They could see the equipment stowed on the sides, the field gray uniforms of the Panzer Grenadiers, the black cross insignia. The German vehicles were perfectly spaced, a textbook example of road march discipline. It was this very discipline, this adherence to doctrine, that made them so vulnerable. They presented themselves as a column, one after another, an ideal scenario for an ambush. Staff Sergeant Harper waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. The temptation to open fire on the first vehicle was immense, but the key to a successful ambush is not just surprise, but devastating effect. He needed to let the lead vehicle pass his position, creating a plug at the front of the column while his gun engaged the one behind it. This would trap the vehicles in between, sowing maximum chaos and preventing a quick withdrawal. His command was a single, sharp word. The 37-millimeter gun, so often derided, barked with a high-velocity crack that was shockingly loud in the winter quiet. The M51 APC round crossed the short distance to the target in a fraction of a second. It wasn't an explosion. It was an impact, a violent meeting of two pieces of steel. The physics of the encounter were brutal and unforgiving. The German Sd.Kfz 251 side armor, a mere 8 millimeters thick, was never intended to withstand such a blow. The hardened steel cap of the American shell struck the plate, shattering the brittle surface. The penetrator behind it, carrying all the kinetic energy imparted by the gun, punched through the armor as if it were cardboard. There was a metallic shriek, a shower of white-hot sparks, and then the shell was inside the crew compartment. The effect within the tight confines of the half-track was catastrophic. The shell itself, now a jagged piece of metal, ricocheted wildly. But far more lethal was the spalling. The inner wall of the German armor plate, stressed beyond its limits, disintegrated, sending a cone of red-hot metal fragments, spall, scything through the passenger bay at supersonic speeds. Ammunition and fuel ignited, and a split second after the Greyhound's gun fired, the German half-track erupted in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. It slewed sideways, its tracks churning uselessly before grinding to a halt, blocking the road. Before the German column could react, the American crew performed their well-drilled task. The loader ejected the smoking casing, the metallic clang echoing inside the turret, and slammed another APC round into the breech. The gunner, already on his next target, traversed slightly and fired again. The second half-track, just behind the first, suffered an identical fate. A sharp crack, a metallic clang, and another vehicle was transformed into a burning wreck. The surprise was total. The Panzer Grenadiers in the other vehicles scrambled to dismount, leaping over the sides of their half-tracks and diving for the ditches, seeking cover from a threat they could not yet see. Their training took over, but they were disoriented, their leaders likely casualties in the first two vehicles. The column, moments before an instrument of disciplined aggression, was now a confused traffic jam of burning metal and panicked men. From their concealed position, the crew of the M8 had a commanding view. They had stopped the head of the serpent. The element of surprise had been absolute, and the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The German soldiers, who had been advancing with the confidence of conquerors, were suddenly confronted with their own shocking vulnerability. Their trusted Sd.Kfz 251, the vehicle that was supposed to carry them to victory, had become a death trap. The air filled with the crackle of the fires, the hiss of melting snow, and the sporadic, unnamed rifle fire of the surviving Germans. For the American crew, the initial adrenaline surge was replaced by a cold focus. They had won the first critical seconds of the engagement. Now they had to survive the aftermath. The German response, once the initial shock subsided, was predictable yet dangerous. Small arms fire began to snap and crackle through the trees, MG-42 machine guns opening up with their characteristic tearing canvas sound. Bullets sparked harmlessly off the Greyhound's angled glacis plate. The American crew was safe from the riflemen, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the Germans brought heavier weapons to bear. A Panzerfaust, a mortar, or a supporting tank could quickly turn their steel sanctuary into a tomb. This was the moment of truth for a reconnaissance unit, the decision to break contact. Harper's job was not to annihilate the column, but to stop it, report it, and survive to fight another day. With the road blocked by two burning wrecks and the enemy column in disarray, he had achieved his objective. He gave the order to pull back. The driver slammed the M8 into reverse, and the six-wheeled vehicle skillfully maneuvered back into the deeper concealment of the forest, its engine roaring in protest. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of carnage and confusion. News of the ambush spread like wildfire through both armies. For the Americans, it was a desperately needed piece of good news. It was proof that the German juggernaut could be stopped, that small, determined units could inflict disproportionate damage. The crews of the M8 Greyhounds, often feeling like second-class citizens in an army that lionized tankers, suddenly found themselves in possession of a giant killing reputation. Their confidence surged. They began to hunt aggressively, using their speed and small size to set up short-range ambushes, strike hard, and then melt away. They turned the winding, forested roads of the Ardennes into their private hunting grounds, becoming a persistent, nagging threat that the Germans could not ignore. On the German side, the psychological impact was the inverse. For the Panzer Grenadiers of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the Stavelot ambush was a profound shock. It shattered the illusion of their own superiority and the perceived weakness of American resistance. More importantly, it revealed a critical, unforeseen vulnerability in their equipment. The Sd.Kfz 251 was no longer a safe conveyance. It was a target. This realization forced a fundamental change in German tactics. Columns could no longer push ahead with infantry-laden half-tracks leading the way. Every advance now had to be preceded by tanks, such as the Panzer IV, to scout for and eliminate the threat of the marauding Greyhounds. This dramatically slowed the pace of the entire German advance. A reconnaissance versus reconnaissance duel was now a tank versus reconnaissance problem. And that problem took time to solve. Peiper's aggressive timetable, already tight, began to unravel. Every hour spent cautiously probing a road instead of racing down it was an hour the Americans could use to reinforce, regroup, and stabilize the front. The M8 ambushes were creating more than just local delays. They were injecting friction and caution into an offensive plan that relied entirely on speed and momentum. The tactical problem had strategic consequences. The Battle of the Bulge was a gamble, a desperate last-ditch effort that depended on reaching the Meuse River within days. The unexpected effectiveness of a handful of American scout cars was like throwing sand in the gears of the German war machine. What German intelligence had correctly identified as a light scout car was, in the specific context of the Ardennes, functioning as a highly effective tank destroyer, at least a half-track destroyer. The failure was not in the data the Germans collected, but in their interpretation of it. They had focused on a single scenario, the M8 versus a tank, and ignored all others. They failed to appreciate that in war, the good enough weapon in the right place at the right time is infinitely more valuable than the perfect weapon that is unavailable or misapplied. The 37mm gun, an obsolete relic by the standards of tank-on-tank combat, had found its perfect prey. The American crews, once wary of their mounts, now understood the unique power they wielded. The engagements around Stavelot were not an isolated incident. Across the entire Ardennes front, a similar story was unfolding. American cavalry groups, thrust into the breach, were discovering the same lethal equation that Staff Sergeant Harper's crew had demonstrated. The Greyhound, previously viewed as a fragile thoroughbred, was now being used like a junkyard dog, fighting with a tenacity that surprised both friend and foe. The effectiveness of these tactics hinged on a deep understanding of the equipment's strengths and weaknesses. The M8 crews knew their armor was thin. They compensated with clever positioning, using the folds of the terrain, the dense forests, and the shadows of village buildings to achieve tactical surprise. They lived by the cavalryman's creed, hit and run. They never sought a prolonged stand-up fight. Their goal was to deliver a sharp, shocking blow and then reposition, leaving the enemy confused and bleeding. The 37mm M6 gun was the centerpiece of this deadly new calculus. While it lacked the sheer explosive power of a larger 75mm shell from a Sherman tank, it had two crucial advantages in these specific engagements: a high muzzle velocity and a fantastic rate of fire. The high velocity meant the APC round flew on a very flat trajectory, making it incredibly accurate at the short ranges typical of Ardennes ambushes. A gunner didn't have to worry much about shell drop. He could simply put the crosshairs on the target and fire, confident of a hit. An experienced, well-drilled crew could get off 15 to 20 rounds a minute, a blistering rate of fire that could rip apart a light-skinned vehicle before its crew even knew what was happening. This technical capability, when paired with ambush tactics, was devastating. A Greyhound could disable the first and last vehicles in a small convoy, trapping the ones in the middle, and then pour rapid, accurate fire into them, turning a section of road into a killing zone in under a minute. It was a microcosm of a broader principle of industrial warfare that was defining the outcome of the Second World War. Germany often focused on producing technologically superior, and therefore complex and expensive, super weapons like the Tiger and Panther tanks. These were formidable machines, but they were difficult to manufacture in large numbers and demanding to maintain in the field. The United States, by contrast, pursued a philosophy of mass production, churning out vast quantities of equipment that was good enough for the job. The M8 Greyhound was a perfect example of this philosophy. It was not the best armored car in the world, nor did it have the most powerful gun, but it was reliable, it was fast, and it was available in huge numbers. The American industrial base could produce Greyhounds far faster than German industry could produce Sd.Kfz, 251s. In the brutal arithmetic of a war of attrition, this was the only math that mattered. For every half-track the Germans lost, the replacement was far away and hard to come by. For every Greyhound lost, there were dozens more being unloaded at the port of Antwerp. This industrial disparity created a strategic context where the tactical successes of the M8s had a cumulative, draining effect on the German army. Every half-track destroyed was not just a vehicle lost. It was a squad of trained infantrymen taken off the line, a disruption to the supply chain, and another blow to the already fragile morale of the German soldier. The confidence of the Panzer Grenadiers was being systematically dismantled, not by massive tank battles, but by fleeting, violent encounters with an enemy they had been told to disregard. The legend of the Greyhound was being forged in the snow, one burning half-track at a time. It was a lesson written in steel. In the complex ecosystem of the battlefield, even the most overlooked predator can find its niche and thrive. The ripples of these small unit actions eventually reached the highest levels of command. Post-war analysis, conducted with the cold, dispassionate clarity of hindsight, would fully vindicate the Greyhound's performance and expose the flawed German assessment. American military theorists, studying the after-action reports from the Ardennes, confirmed that the M8 had performed its primary mission of reconnaissance and screening exceptionally well under the most extreme circumstances. But they also noted its surprising lethality when miscast in a defensive ambush role. The Battle of the Bulge provided a wealth of data that would directly influence future armored vehicle design within the U.S. Army. The lesson was clear. Reconnaissance vehicles needed more punch. The 37mm gun had been just enough to handle the light vehicles of 1944, but the trend in warfare was toward thicker armor on all vehicle types. Future American armored cars and reconnaissance vehicles would be designed with heavier armament, moving toward cannons in the 75 and 90mm class. The age of the pea shooter was officially over, but its last stand in the Belgian winter had been a spectacular one. On the German side, the analysis was equally illuminating, if far more sobering. For them, the key takeaway was the stark vulnerability of the half-track design. The Sd.Kfz, 251, the symbol of the Blitzkrieg, was a relic of an earlier phase of the war. Its open top exposed its occupants to air-bursting artillery, and its thin side armor offered almost no protection against the rapidly proliferating light anti-tank weapons and up-gunned armored cars of the Allies. The German engineers had created a vehicle perfectly suited for the campaigns of 1940 and 1941, but by 1944, the battlefield had evolved. The prevalence of American Shermans, and now the surprising effectiveness of the M8s, meant that German infantry could no longer count on their transports to survive direct contact with the enemy. This realization would heavily influence the design of the post-war German Bundeswehr. When Germany began to rearm, they abandoned the half-track concept entirely. Instead, they embraced fully tracked armored personnel carriers like the Schützenpanzer Lang HS-30 and later the legendary Marder. These vehicles were designed with the harsh lessons of the Ardennes in mind. They featured enclosed crew compartments for all-around protection, thicker, better-sloped armor to defeat light anti-tank rounds, and heavier armament, often a 20mm autocannon, capable of engaging both ground and air targets. In essence, the German army learned from its bloody encounters with the M8 Greyhound and ensured their future infantry carriers would not share the same fatal weaknesses as the Sd.Kfz. 251. The Stavelot ambush and similar engagements serve as a perfect historical case study in the interplay between intelligence, doctrine, and technology. German intelligence was factually correct about the M8's specifications. Their doctrine, however, failed to adapt to the specific conditions of the battlefield. They applied a rigid, tank-centric view of the world and missed the nuances of a different kind of threat. Their technology, in the form of the half-track, had been rendered obsolete by their opponent's mass-produced, good-enough solution. The story is a powerful reminder that wars are not won by specification sheets or pre-war analyses. They are won by adaptability, by exploiting unforeseen weaknesses, and by the courage of soldiers like Staff Sergeant Robert Harper, who take the tools they are given and use them with skill and deadly ingenuity. The legacy of these small, vicious fights in the snow is written in the very DNA of modern armored vehicles, a testament to a moment in history when the humble Greyhound punched far, far above its weight. The narrative of the M8 Greyhound in the Ardennes is more than just a tale of technological mismatch. It's a deeply human story. Inside the cold, cramped hull of each armored car was a crew of 4 men, bound together by the unique intimacy of combat. They were often volunteers for the cavalry, men with a penchant for independence and a willingness to operate far from the main lines. They had to be mechanics, gunners, and navigators all at once. A self-contained unit that had to think on its feet. For these crews, the Battle of the Bulge was a crucible that forged a new relationship with their vehicle. What might have been seen as a flimsy scout car in the summer campaigns of France became a trusted steed in the winter forest. They learned its every groan and shudder, the precise tension of the gun's traverse wheel, the exact moment to shift gears to keep the engine from stalling in the deep snow. This intimate knowledge was their edge. They knew, for instance, that their wheeled configuration, often a disadvantage in muddy terrain, gave them a critical advantage on the icy, narrow roads of the Ardennes, allowing for faster movement and quicker escapes than a fully tracked vehicle. This personal connection stands in stark contrast to the experience of the German Panzer Grenadiers. For them, the Sd.Kfz 251 was becoming a source of dread. Riding in the open-topped compartment, they were exposed to the elements, the biting wind and freezing snow, a constant misery. But worse was the dawning realization of their own vulnerability. Every shadow in the trees, every bend in the road, could conceal an American armored car. The sharp, distinctive crack of a 37mm gun became a sound of impending doom. This psychological pressure cannot be overstated. An army's effectiveness is built on confidence. Confidence in its leaders, its tactics, and its equipment. The M8 ambushes systematically eroded the German infantryman's faith in his transport. A soldier who does not trust his vehicle to get him to the battle safely is a soldier who arrives with his fighting spirit already diminished. The morale of the American cavalrymen, conversely, soared. They were inflicting visible, undeniable damage on an enemy that had, just days before, seemed invincible. They were holding the line. This boost in morale had a cascading effect, inspiring other units and stiffening the resolve of the entire American front. It was a classic example of asymmetric warfare. A numerically inferior and supposedly outgunned force using unconventional tactics to neutralize the advantages of a stronger opponent. The Greyhounds weren't trying to win a battle of annihilation. They were fighting a battle of attrition and delay. Every German half-track they destroyed was a small victory, but the cumulative effect of hundreds of these small victories was the slowing and eventual halt of the entire German offensive. This speaks to a larger truth about the nature of the war on the Western Front. While the grand battles of encirclement and annihilation defined the Eastern Front, the fighting in the West was often a grinding affair, a war of logistics and production. The victory of the M8 over the Sd.Kfz 251 was, in miniature, the victory of the Allied war effort. It was the triumph of mass production over boutique manufacturing, of adaptable tactics over rigid doctrine, and of the resilience of the common soldier, the GI who proved time and again that the quality of the man behind the gun was just as important as the caliber of the weapon itself. The clash in the Ardennes was not merely a footnote in the history of armored warfare. It was a pivotal chapter demonstrating that the perceived value of a weapon system is entirely dependent on the context in which it is used. The Germans saw a scout car. The Americans, in their moment of greatest need, discovered they had a perfect ambush predator. Let us revisit the epicenter of this tactical upheaval, the moment of impact. The 37mm M51 armor-piercing capped round weighed just under 2 pounds. Fired from the M6 gun, it left the barrel traveling at over 2,900 feet per second. At typical combat ranges in the Ardennes, often less than 500 yards, it would strike a target with over 36 millimeters of armor penetration capability. This raw number is the key that unlocks the entire story. It was a number that German intelligence either did not have or, more likely, dismissed as irrelevant because it was insufficient to defeat their tanks. They failed to cross-reference that penetration value with the armor value of their most numerous armored vehicle, the Sd.Kfz 251. The half-track's 6 to 8 millimeters of side armor was not just inadequate, it was catastrophically so. The American shell would not just pierce it, it would over-penetrate, retaining a huge amount of its kinetic energy as it passed through the crew compartment. This brutal efficiency explains the shocking suddenness of the half-track's destruction. There was often no protracted fight, no exchange of fire. One moment, a functioning vehicle with 10 infantrymen was advancing. The next, it was a burning, inert wreck. This wasn't just combat. It was an almost industrial process of destruction, enabled by a fatal mismatch in hardware. Obersturmbannführer German Peiper, a commander known for his ruthless drive, found his advance being bled to death by 1,000 small cuts. His Kampfgruppe was a finely tuned instrument of breakthrough, but it was being thwarted by an enemy that refused to fight on his terms. The Americans were not forming battle lines to be smashed by his panthers. They were ghosts in the woods, striking his vulnerable flanks and supply lines, forcing him to detach precious tanks for escort duty, and compelling his infantry to dismount and clear the forests on foot. Every such delay was a victory for the defenders. It gave American commanders more time to move divisions like the 82nd Airborne to shore up the northern shoulder of the Bulge, boxing Peiper in. The strategic goal of the German offensive was to fracture the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. That goal relied on a lightning-fast advance. The tactical problem presented by the M8 Greyhounds, replicated across the front, was a critical factor in the failure to achieve that speed. It demonstrates a fundamental principle of warfare. The logistical and support elements of an army are as vital as its frontline combat troops. By attacking the soft vehicles, the half-tracks carrying the infantry and supplies, the American cavalry was effectively attacking the muscular and nervous system of the German armored fist. A tank without infantry support is vulnerable, and an army without fuel and ammunition is just a collection of static targets. The Greyhound crews, whether they fully realized it at the time or not, were waging a brilliant campaign of interdiction, strangling the German advance far more effectively than they could have by engaging in futile duels with heavy tanks. Their actions were a testament to the U.S. Army's doctrine of combined arms even when applied in desperate ad hoc situations. They understood that their role was not to be a miniature tank, but to be a scalpel used to sever the weaker tissues connecting the enemy's armored bones. The Ardennes campaign would ultimately be decided by larger factors: Allied air power, the defense of Bastogne, and the sheer industrial might that could replace losses at an unsustainable rate for the Germans. Yet within that grand strategic picture, the story of the scout car that became a hunter is an essential chapter. It is a lesson in the importance of looking beyond the obvious, of understanding that in the complex, chaotic environment of the battlefield, the most dangerous threat can sometimes come from the most unexpected quarter. As the Ardennes snows began to melt, revealing the frozen, scarred landscape of the battlefield, the legend of the Greyhound was cemented. The wreckage of dozens of German half-tracks, strewn along the winding roads near places like Stavelot, stood as a silent testament to the armored car's deadly effectiveness. For the men of the cavalry reconnaissance squadrons, they had not just survived the German army's last great offensive, they had played a pivotal role in defeating it. They had entered the battle as scouts and emerged as legends, their reputation forever altered by their performance in the crucible of winter combat. The story of the M8 Greyhound and the Sd.Kfz 251 is more than a simple David versus Goliath tale. It is a nuanced lesson in the complexities of modern warfare. It illustrates that a weapon's value is not absolute, but is defined by the specific tactical situation in which it is deployed. The 37mm gun was, by any objective measure, obsolete for tank-on-tank fighting in 1944. But against the right target, from an ambush position, it was the perfect tool for the job. It was a weapon that found its moment. This episode also serves as a stark warning against the dangers of intellectual arrogance in military planning. German intelligence possessed accurate data but suffered from a profound failure of imagination. They could not conceive of a scenario where the lowly American scout car posed a serious threat to their mechanized columns. Their rigid, hierarchical thinking, focused entirely on the high-end threat of enemy tanks, created a blind spot that American cavalrymen exploited with lethal results. It's a timeless lesson that resonates in military academies to this day. Know your enemy, but also know your own vulnerabilities, especially the ones you are tempted to dismiss. Ultimately, the duel in the Ardennes was a victory for the concept of the good enough war machine. The M8 Greyhound was a simple, reliable, and mass-produced vehicle, crewed by well-trained and adaptable soldiers. It represented a philosophy of warfare that valued practicality and numbers over technological perfectionism. In the end, the war was won not by the handful of exquisite, over-engineered Tiger tanks that were the pride of the German army, but by the tens of thousands of Sherman tanks, the millions of Garand rifles, and, in its own small but significant way, by the humble M8 Greyhound. Its story is a tribute to the soldiers who crewed them, men like Staff Sergeant Robert Harper, who, on a frozen morning in December, faced with overwhelming odds, did not see a compromised vehicle. They saw a weapon. And in their hands, this overlooked scout car became one of the most effective predators of the Battle of the Bulge, proving once and for all that in the calculus of war, surprise, courage, and hitting the right target with the right shell are what truly count.